Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The kingdom lay in ruins, its towering walls, once a symbol of strength and defiance, crumbled under the weight of time and war. Smoke choked the skies, casting an eternal twilight over the desolate land. The demonic army had come without warning, sweeping through the kingdom like a plague, reducing its cities to smoldering ashes. Now, only whispers of hope remained, flickering like dying embers in the hearts of those few who had not yet succumbed to despair. Lorien, a knight who had once sworn his sword to the royal family, walked through the wreckage of what had been the capital. His armor was tarnished, dented from countless battles, his cloak tattered and darkened by soot and blood. His steps were heavy, burdened by the weight of failure. He had once been a man of purpose, bound by honor and duty, but those days were long gone. Now, he wandered the fringes of the kingdom, a ghost of the man he had been, haunted by the collapse of everything he once knew. The king was dead, and with him, the royal bloodline had perished. The throne, the symbol of their empire, was no more than a pile of charred wood and molten metal. But still, there was a glimmer of hope, a desperate plea for salvation that had found its way to Lorien. A messenger, a boy no older than 16, had found him at the edge of the forest, where the last remnants of the kingdom's council had hidden. "They need you," the boy had said, his voice trembling. "The council believes you are the last hope." Lorien had laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed in the stillness of the trees. "Hope?" he had asked. "There is no hope left in this kingdom." But the boy had been persistent, and the weight of those words, spoken with such naive conviction, had finally broken through the armor of Lorien's indifference. He had once been a man of duty, after all, and old habits died hard. Now, as he walked through the ruins of the palace, his thoughts were consumed by the task that lay before him. The council had charged him with finding the one who might save the kingdom, or destroy it. A witch, they said, cursed and dangerous, exiled to the farthest reaches of the empire. Legend spoke of her power, of the doom she would bring upon the world, but also of the possibility of redemption. If she could be convinced to help, perhaps there was a chance. The forest loomed ahead, its dark canopy a stark contrast to the lifeless ruins behind him. Lorien had always hated this place, a place of shadows and whispers, where the line between the living and the dead blurred. He had come here once before, in the days of his youth, when the kingdom still flourished. Back then, the forest had seemed less threatening, its mysteries intriguing rather than foreboding. Now, it felt like a tomb. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew thick with magic, the kind that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The trees were twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands, and the path beneath his feet seemed to shift, leading him in circles. But Lorien was not easily deterred. He had faced far worse than this in the years since the war began. At last, he reached a clearing, where a small, dilapidated cabin stood at the center. Smoke curled from the chimney, a faint sign of life in an otherwise dead place. Lorien approached cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The legends said the witch was cursed, that her power could bend reality itself, and though he had come seeking her help, he would not be caught off guard. The door creaked open before he could knock, and a figure stepped into the doorway. She was not what he had expected. Celine, the cursed witch, was young, no older than Lorien himself. Her hair, black as midnight, cascaded over her shoulders, and her eyes, a piercing shade of violet, seemed to see through him, as though she knew every secret he had ever kept. There was an otherworldly beauty to her, a kind of dangerous allure that sent a shiver down his spine. "You've come to kill me," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "Or is it something else you seek, knight?" "I've come to ask for your help," Lorien replied, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "The kingdom is dying. You are our last hope." She laughed, a sound as cold as the wind that rustled the trees. "Hope? There is no hope left, not for this kingdom, not for anyone." "And yet here I am," Lorien said, stepping forward. "I was told you might be able to change that." Celine's gaze darkened, and for a moment, Lorien thought she might turn him into ash with a mere glance. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of the world pressed down upon her. "Do you know why they cursed me?" she asked, her tone shifting to something more vulnerable. "Why they fear me?" Lorien shook his head. "Because they know the truth," she continued. "That I hold the power to destroy the kingdom. But what they don't understand is that I can also save it, if I choose." "And will you?" Lorien asked. Celine's eyes met his, and in them, he saw not the monster the legends had painted her to be, but a woman burdened by a fate she did not ask for. "I don't know," she admitted. "But perhaps, together, we can find out." They set out the next morning, the weight of their uncertain alliance hanging between them like a shadow. Lorien had never trusted magic, and he certainly didn't trust Celine, but he had no choice. The kingdom's fate rested on their shoulders, and for better or worse, they were bound together by the task at hand. As they journeyed through the desolate landscape, they encountered the remnants of the demonic invasion. Villages lay in ruin, their inhabitants slaughtered or driven mad by the presence of dark magic. Lorien's heart hardened with every step, the weight of his failure growing heavier with each scene of devastation. But through it all, Celine remained distant, her face a mask of indifference, as though the destruction did not touch her. "Doesn't any of this bother you?" Lorien asked one night as they camped beneath the twisted trees of a once thriving forest. Celine glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Of course it does. But I've learned that caring only makes things worse." "That's a coward's answer," Lorien said, his voice sharp with anger. "You have the power to help, to change things, and yet you stand by and do nothing." "And what would you have me do, knight?" Celine snapped, her eyes flashing with anger of her own. "Wave my hand and make everything better? Magic doesn't work that way. There are consequences to every action, and sometimes, the cost is too great." Lorien was silent, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He had seen too much death, too much suffering, to accept that there was nothing that could be done. But deep down, he knew Celine was right. The power she wielded was dangerous, and if used carelessly, it could bring about even more destruction. Their uneasy alliance was tested further when they encountered a group of survivors, hiding in the ruins of a once grand fortress. The survivors were distrustful of Celine, whispering about her curse and the doom she was said to bring. But Lorien defended her, though he wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was because he saw something in her that reminded him of himself, someone who had been cast aside by the very people they had once sworn to protect. But even Lorien's loyalty was tested when the demons attacked the fortress. The battle was fierce, the air thick with the stench of blood and magic. Lorien fought with all his might, his sword flashing in the dim light as he cut down demon after demon. But it was Celine's magic that turned the tide. Her power was unlike anything Lorien had ever seen, raw and untamed, bending the very fabric of reality to her will. She summoned storms of fire and lightning, reducing the demons to ash, but with each spell she cast, Lorien could see the toll it took on her. The curse that bound her was not just a legend, it was real, and it was killing her. Every time she used her magic, it consumed a part of her soul, drawing her closer to the fate she had been trying to escape. After the battle, as they stood among the bodies of the fallen, Lorien confronted her. "You're dying," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Celine didn't deny it. The curse was designed that way. The more I use my power, the closer I come to fulfilling my destiny. And what destiny is that? Lorien asked. To destroy the kingdom. Lorien's heart sank. He had known the risk when he had sought her out, but hearing the truth spoken aloud made it all the more real. But there's still time, Celine said, her voice soft. I can choose to save the kingdom instead. But if I do, I will die. Lorien stared at her, torn between duty and the growing bond he felt with her. He had come to save the kingdom, but now, he wasn't sure if the price was worth it. As they made their way toward the capital, the final stronghold of the empire, Lorien knew the end was near. The demonic army had gathered for a final assault, and the fate of the kingdom would be decided in the coming days. The battle was unlike anything Lorien had ever experienced. The sky was filled with fire, the ground shaking beneath the weight of the demon horde. Lorien fought with everything he had, his sword a blur as he cut through the enemy ranks. But for every demon he felled, a dozen more took its place, and then, in the midst of the chaos, he saw Celine, standing at the heart of the battlefield, her eyes glowing with a fierce light. She was preparing to unleash her full power, to sacrifice herself to save the kingdom. No! Lorien shouted, cutting his way through the enemy to reach her. There has to be another way. But Celine shook her head, her expression sad but resolute. This is the only way. The curse was meant to destroy, but I can use it to protect. I can save them, Lorien. I can save you. Tears filled Lorien's eyes as he reached her, grabbing her arm. Don't do this. We can find another way. But Celine only smiled, her hand brushing against his cheek. You've already saved me. With a final surge of magic, Celine unleashed her power, a blinding light that engulfed the battlefield. The demons screamed as they were consumed by the firestorm, their bodies turning to ash. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The battlefield was silent, the demons gone. But so was Celine. Lorien fell to his knees, his heart breaking as he stared at the spot where she had stood. She had saved them, but at the cost of her own life. In the days that followed, the survivors began to rebuild, their hope renewed by Celine's sacrifice. The kingdom, though scarred, still stood, a testament to the strength of those who had fought for it, and Lorien, the knight who had once abandoned his duty, now stood as the last guardian of the burning throne. But the throne was no longer a symbol of power or authority, it was a symbol of sacrifice, of the bond between a knight and a witch, and the strength of humanity when united against the darkness. As he gazed out over the land, Lorien knew that the kingdom would survive, not because of kings or thrones, but because of the people who had fought for it, and the sacrifices that had been made. Lorien stood at the edge of the ruined capital, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the smoke from the last battle still lingered like a ghost in the distance. The sky above had cleared, but the scars of the kingdom's near destruction remained visible in every shattered wall and broken street. His body ached from the wounds of war, but it was the emptiness in his chest that weighed on him most. Celine was gone, her sacrifice having saved the kingdom from annihilation. Yet, as the days passed, the victory felt hollow. The people hailed him as a hero, the knight who had led them to salvation, but he could not shake the feeling that it had come at a cost far too steep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, the way she had smiled in those final moments before unleashing her magic. You've already saved me. The words echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the bond they had forged in the midst of chaos and destruction. He had come to her seeking a way to save the kingdom, but in the end, she had been the one to show him that there was more to salvation than just survival. It was about sacrifice, about giving everything for the people who couldn't fight for themselves. Lorien's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword as he turned away from the broken city. The war was over, but his duty was not. There were still enemies lurking in the shadows, remnants of the demonic army that had yet to be driven out. And though the kingdom had been spared, its future was uncertain. The people needed a leader, someone who could guide them through the rebuilding process. But Lorien did not see himself as that leader. He was a soldier, a knight, someone who had spent his life in service to the crown, not ruling over it. The council had asked him to take the throne, to become the new king in the absence of any royal bloodline, but he had refused. The throne was a relic of a past that no longer existed. What the people needed now was not another monarch, but a future that did not rely on ancient symbols of power. He walked through the streets, nodding to the citizens who bowed or waved as he passed. Many of them had lost everything: family, homes, their livelihoods, but they carried on with a grim determination. Lorien admired that about them. Despite all the suffering they had endured, they still clung to hope, just as Celine had. As he approached the central square, he saw a group of children playing near the fountain. The sight brought a faint smile to his face, a brief flicker of something resembling peace. The children, at least, seemed unaffected by the horrors that had befallen the kingdom. They chased each other around the fountain, laughing and shouting in the way only children could. It reminded him of a simpler time, before the war, when he had been just another boy dreaming of knighthood. One of the children, a young girl with messy brown hair, noticed him watching and waved excitedly. "Sir Lorien! Sir Lorien!" she called, running over to him with wide eyes. He knelt down to meet her gaze, offering her a gentle smile. "What's your name?" "Amara," she said, beaming up at him. "My papa says you're a hero." Lorien's smile faltered for just a moment. "Is that so? And what do you think?" Amara tilted her head, considering the question. "I think you're a knight. And knights are brave." He chuckled softly. "Well, sometimes knights have to be brave even when they don't feel like it." Amara frowned. "You don't feel brave?" Lorien's heart clenched at the innocence in her voice. "Not always," he admitted. "But that's okay. We don't have to feel brave all the time. What matters is that we keep going, even when we're scared." She seemed to think about that for a moment, then nodded solemnly. "I think you're still a hero." Before he could respond, Amara ran back to her friends, her laughter ringing through the air as they resumed their game. Lorien watched her go, a strange sense of warmth filling the void inside him. Maybe he wasn't the hero people believed him to be, but if the children could see something in him worth admiring, perhaps that was enough. He rose to his feet, his thoughts turning once again to the future. The council had asked him to remain in the capital, to help with the reconstruction efforts and oversee the rebuilding of the kingdom's defenses. It was an honor, they said, to have the knight who had saved them lead the charge in restoring their world. But Lorien knew that staying here would only keep him trapped in the memories of what had been lost. He needed to move forward, to find a new path for himself. The kingdom would rebuild with or without him, just as it had done after every war before this one. What mattered now was ensuring that it had a future, one free of the mistakes of the past. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. He turned to see one of the council members, a stern-looking man named Darrick, making his way toward him. "Sir Lorien," Darrick greeted, his tone respectful but authoritative. "The council wishes to speak with you. They're preparing for the coronation ceremony." Lorien shook his head. "I already told you, I'm not interested in taking the throne." Darrick frowned. "The people need a leader, Sir Lorien. They need someone to guide them through these difficult times. The throne belongs to you now. The throne belongs to no one, Lorien replied, his voice firm. It's time for the kingdom to move beyond the old ways. We don't need kings and thrones to survive. And what would you have us do? Darrick asked, frustration creeping into his voice. We've lost our royal bloodline, our city lies in ruins, and our enemies are still out there, waiting for any sign of weakness. Without leadership, we will fall. Then lead, Lorien said simply. You and the other council members are more than capable. You've already been doing it for years, even when the king was still alive. You don't need a figurehead. You need unity. Darrick opened his mouth to argue, but Lorien held up a hand, stopping him. I've done what I came here to do. I fought for this kingdom, for its people. But my place is not on a throne. I'm a knight, not a king. For a moment, Darrick stood there, his expression conflicted. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he nodded. Very well. But know this, if you ever change your mind, the kingdom will always welcome you. Lorien offered a small, grateful smile. Thank you. But I think it's time I found my own path. Darrick nodded again before turning and walking away, leaving Lorien alone in the square once more. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ruined city, Lorien took one last look at the place he had called home for so many years. The weight of the kingdom's fate no longer rested on his shoulders, but that didn't mean his journey was over. There were still battles to be fought, injustices to be righted, and perhaps, somewhere out there, a way to honor Celine's sacrifice. With a final glance at the children playing by the fountain, Lorien turned and walked away from the capital, his steps lighter than they had been in years. He didn't know where the road ahead would take him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something that had eluded him for so long. Hope, the burning throne, once a symbol of power and control, now stood as a reminder of the sacrifices made for a brighter future. And though the kingdom had been saved, Lorien knew that its true strength lay not in crowns or thrones, but in the hearts of the people who had fought to protect it. As the night disappeared into the fading light, the kingdom began to heal, its people united by the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, there was always a way forward. And in the distance, where the horizon met the sky, the promise of a new dawn awaited.